Hello, everybody, and welcome to VFR. Today we are here on the ground at Dallas Love Field, KDAL, and we are taking a look at why you should fly the PMDG 737-700 specifically today, but 737 in general, and even airliners more generally, at least in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So, if you've been living under a rock or you haven't seen, we've had a flurry of releases for Flight Simulator in May of 2022. And it's a really exciting time, I think, for a lot of people are getting a lot of cool new things to try out and really fleshing out the sim. And today we're going to be doing my personal plane of choice, the 737. And just exploring, again, why that's a fun, unique airplane. Now, obviously, the 737 is an old design. It's an airplane that's been around for a long time. It was originally designed in the 1960s and started flying in the 1960s. And it's gone through many iterations since then. This particular model, the 737-700, is a Boeing next generation airplane, which was developed in the 1990s, delivered late 90s, early 2000s. And were delivered up until, it's different variants were produced into the 2010s. So the last 737-900 was delivered in 2019, I believe. So relatively modern in the world of airplane design. And, but just really kind of the quintessential passenger jetliner, I think, at least from an American or North American perspective. And even in Europe, too, and across the world, especially other places, there are a lot of 737s flying in China, too. There's just a lot of 737s out there. And when you think of a passenger jet, a lot of people think of a 737. That's kind of the popular notion of it. So like I said, 737 series starts in the 1960s. You have the 737 Classics, which are developed in the 80s. It's a Dash 300, 400, 500 or so. And then our next generation airplane here, which was in the 1990s, developed and first flown, entered service around that time and into the 2000s. Its replacement is the famous or the infamous 737 MAX series, which is currently kind of the latest and greatest in 737 design. And then there's, rumors Boeing has been saying for a long time that there's a clean sheet new airliner that will kind of take this role in the market sometime in the 2030s. But again, they've been saying that for a long time. This airplane, the 737-700, is kind of the second smallest next generation 737. You have a 737-600, which is even shorter than this one. Then you have the 700, which is primarily flown by airlines like Southwest. Has a lot of 737-700s, but also United and Delta have some. The most ubiquitous one is the 737-800, which as of now, about June 2022, is coming soon from PMDG. They'll be releasing that as a separate package for you in the 800, but that's the most common. There are over 4,000 737-800s. There's about 1,000 737-700s. And then smaller numbers of both the 900, which is the longest variant, and the 600, which is the shortest of this particular generation. This airplane has 149 seats in its one class configuration, like we were flying with Southwest. But if you have two classes, or like a business class and an economy class, you might have 120 passengers on an airplane like this. You have CFM56 engines, a maximum takeoff weight of 144,000 pounds for the, then this is all for the 737-700 passenger variant, and flying up to 41,000 feet, and a cruise Mach of around 0.78. Now, with the PMDG does have, with this 737-700, you also get a BBJ, which is a private jet version, basically, with a large, with more, fewer seats, but it's more of it's like a flying conference room, really. Big private jet. And you can add aux fuel tanks to that one, and you could fly basically anywhere you could dream of. So that's a really a good option. You could fly across the Atlantic Ocean. You could fly well beyond that. You can, I think that bumps the range up to something like 6,000 nautical miles or something. And we also have a cargo version, too, for the 737-700. Again, not as really ubiquitous as the 737-800 cargo versions, but there are airlines flying it out in the world. So it is a very cool package. So you get a cargo version, you get a business jet version, and this is just the standard passenger jet version in a Southwest Airlines livery. So doing a little bit of a walk around, obviously it's you might call it a tube liner. The passengers all sit in the main single aisle in the cabin. We can pop on in there and just see a little bit of it. 3 abreast on both sides in this configuration. And yeah, again, a single aisle cabin configuration. Bathrooms at either end and galley and overhead storage. So nothing too crazy, but very much your typical traditional narrow-body airliner, much like an A320 or an A321 or something like that. We obviously have 2 big jet engines, cargo bays down here where you load all the baggage, Wi-Fi antenna on the top. This can be configured. There's a lot of different options that you could configure this airplane with. So the Wi-Fi antenna is one of them. Also one that's dependent on which livery you have, but the winglet's over here. So this is the standard winglet option. You can also get a split splitter winglet that would be kind of have another downward pointing metal piece on it. So you can get that as well. There are 2 different types that come with this airplane. Obviously, we have some ground support equipment deployed. We have a ground power cart, as well as some loaders, and the baggage has already been loaded, so these trucks don't have anything on them. APU in the back, much like the CRJ, which we kind of talked about in our other video about airliners and why you should fly series. But an APU in the back, a little mini jet engine to generate power and give the main engines, the air they need to start. Can all come off of the APU. Obviously, we're connected to the jetway now here on the ground at Dallas Love. Now, for the flight today, we're going to be flying Southwest 1, which is a daily flight that Southwest does. Very straightforward, pretty short flight, about hour in the air, maybe a little bit less, between Dallas, or in Southwest's Dallas base, and Dallas Love Airport, KDAL, and we're going down to Houston Hobby, KHOU. So we're gonna we'll hop into the cockpit, give a little bit of a tour of the cockpit, and then we'll get it fired up and get on our way. All right, so welcome to the cockpit of the 737-700. Now, this is a pretty straightforward modern cockpit. If you've flown in an A320, like the fly-by-wire A320 or the default one, it feels very similar. You've got most of your information is going to be on these screens here. You have your primary flight display and these other display units around you to show different parameters of the engines and your actual attitude indicator, your altitude. All that kind of stuff is shown on the screens in front of you. You do have an FMC down here to program in all your flight plans and all the data that goes into the flight controller. Standby instruments, these can be configured with a bunch of different configurations. If I go into PMDG setup, aircraft, equipment, and you can change a bunch of stuff. So we could swap between the 2 different autopilot. They have mostly the same functions. There's some slight differences, but there's a Honeywell, the older version, and a Collins version. Those are 2 different variants of the MCP panel up here. You can also, there's just a ton of settings that you can do, but if we look at, we could make it ETOPS, and we'll throw some stickers up, and certify it for ETOPS, give it all those different packages that it needs for extended over water operations. We can look to change our standby instruments. So right now we have them as analog, but if you hit the button, you get this more modern one. And there's just a bunch of different configurations that you can do. Different systems too, like this HGS system. And again, there's a lot of stuff to dig into. Luckily, 737 is such a popular airplane that a lot of this stuff is very well documented on the internet. A lot of pilots have learned how to fly the 737, which is a really blessing because a lot of that stuff is available to you. Whereas a lot more niche airplanes, sometimes it's harder to find that kind of information. But 737 is so ubiquitous in the world that you shouldn't, if you are interested in the nitty-gritty details of all this stuff and what it's like to fly these airplanes, it's probably out there for you to see. So you can configure all the options using the FMS here. No tablet. PMDG says that's going to be coming in a future update here, but an EFB. But for now, we run everything through the tablet. Now, the other thing that we can do from a sim perspective is mess with all of our ground services. So there's a ground services setting here. You can do all of you can connect your ground power. We can dismiss the jetway. We can add air stairs too, that we can change the way we're doing it. We can do air stairs. You can board passengers here. So if I say, really, I want 147 passengers, I can click that in there. I think technically I have to open the doors too. So you can control your doors. You can do refueling. You can call a refueling truck, and it actually, plugs into the airplane, which is it's a small touch, but it's a nice touch. So 147, we can hit start, and that'll load up passengers into the back, and it controls all of the weight and balance and stuff like that, so you don't have to worry about it. Again, you can call galley trucks and everything. So this is all very cool. You can do all your baggage loading. We're going to dismiss these guys for now because we're fully loaded. But as you can see, the different cars will disconnect. They'll close all their doors up, and they will drive away. The really nice touch for the BBJ version is you have passenger SUVs come up, and that's a really nice touch. So you can see you got baggage trucks running away and all that kind of stuff. So you can simulate all your ground handling that way. Now, obviously, most of your control is here. You also have the overhead panel. I have, like other airplanes, have it bound to finicky custom views, so I have an overhead panel custom view. And one nice thing about the Boeing, it's just kind of the same design philosophy throughout all Boeing 737 designs over the years. But essentially, it's divided into these 5 columns or so. And when you're doing your checks, you can just kind of, it doesn't take you too long to figure out where all these switches should be and all the things you're looking for. So as you're setting up the airplane, yaw damper has to come on. We got to turn fuel pumps on if we want to run an engine. Ground power and the electrical stuff was one thing that tripped me up when I was starting out, coming from something like a CRJ, which handles all that pretty automatically. But you have to pick which electrical source you're getting it. Right now we're on ground power. You click that down, you're on ground power. Once we start the APUs, you switch these switches to turn the electrical system over to the APUs, feed it off of that, and then the engines go off the generator. So you have to click all those manually, and if you don't click them in the right order, you'll shut off the power to your airplane. Circuit breakers and everything like that, panel lights, the circuit breakers are back behind us. Window heat, probe heat, hydraulic pumps, anti-ice, all that kind of stuff. Your air conditioning and that kind of stuff. Your APU bleeds and engine bleeds are here. And then your cabin pressure altitude here. So I can't remember what we're cruising at. I'd have to look it up. But again, it's just it gives you a nice setup to go down the line and say, okay, here 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns, 4 columns, 5 columns. Now, the big difference between a Boeing 737 and something like an Airbus is an Airbus is going to basically have a different design philosophy. They use more lighted buttons. So like these kind of things would be buttons, and you want everything either extinguished. I think the rule on an Airbus is you want everything extinguished, but it's just a different design philosophy. It's much more switch oriented in this case. And it hasn't changed very much over the many, many years. So that is a brief overview of the cockpit. Obviously, we have our throttles, we have our flaps, we have our speed brakes. Now, for my controls, I have throttles bound to 2 axes on my joystick setup, speed brakes bound to the other one. And then flaps are controlled over here. You can do engine fire tests, test all your lights and stuff. It'll make a noise and light up. Radio panels down here for all your comm radios and nav radios. You can mess around with this. And this is all nicely integrated into your vPilot systems too. So if you're on VATSIM, you can use this to listen to different frequencies and manipulate it that way as well. Squawk, your transponder down here, you can set your squawk code and stuff like that. Circuit breakers here on the back, and that really is the cockpit. It looks, I think, a little more busy than an Airbus's, than an A320's, and probably a CRJ's. But everything has a purpose, and Boeing has done a lot of continuity. There's a lot of continuity between the original 737, the classic, and then the next gen here on this one. A lot of the stuff carries over from older versions. And I think it's pretty cool. I like the kind of tactile. It's not really tactile because we're not really touching anything, but I like the switches and everything. I find that it pleases me. And yeah, it just scratches that itch in my brain. right, so I'm going to go ahead and get the airplane configured for our departure. We are flying out of KDAL in a 737 as Southwest 1. We will be on VATSIM today. It doesn't look like we have ATC at the moment, so it will be a little bit of a quieter day. But yeah, so heading down to KHOU. Pretty simple flight, about 45 minutes of airtime is what SimBrief is telling me. So we'll get it set up and get on our way. All right, so the airplane is set up now. We're ready to push and start. We're going to go ahead and dismiss the jetway. And then we will we'll fire up our APU if it's not already on. Go ahead and start that. Jetway's pulling away. We can make sure we close the doors. And just do one quick check to make sure we're all good. Now, I think for pushback, we're going to try and stay off that taxiway. We'll probably come out into this area over here. And I was going to sign in with VATSIM, but someone else is using Southwest 1, so it's uncontrolled anyway. We'll fake it. So yeah, we're going to push back off the runway. We're kind of at the corner of the terminal. And then we will start engines as we go now. Engine start's pretty straightforward on this airplane. We're just going to be using this panel, basically. And then the fuel cutoff switch is down here. I am using toolbar pushback, because we're pre-planning pushbacks. Which is really just such a game changer. We'll push, we'll basically try and push straight out. We'll do a multiple, we'll do a multiple node one here. So let's request pushback, get that going. So now, as we're getting ready to push back, here, we'll put our anti-collision lights on, let everyone know we're ready to start our engines. We are going to be on the KHOU 5 departure today out of Dallas Love, taking off on 13 left, which basically means we'll be departing out on runway 13, heading 133 as we programmed in here, top altitude of 8,000 feet, and we'll punch in a initial speed of around 210 knots. We need to be above 6,000 feet at Hayes. You can see it on the map here. And then we'll keep on climbing out there. We'll clear ourselves up to our cruising altitude, which today is flight level 290. Very short flight. We'll see if we even get that far. All right, so ready to rock. We can release parking brake. Well, there's a couple things, actually. We got to get rid of ground power. So here, we can go over to the APU power now. With those two switches. Now we're off ground power. We can release ground power. And remove the wheel chocks. So parking brake is off. We'll take it off hold. And let the tug do its thing. Now to start engines, we're just going to pop this into the GRD mode over to the left, and we're going to watch the engine spool up. We do need APU bleed on, so make sure that that is configured. So packs need to be off, APU bleed needs to be on. You need fuel pumps, obviously, and then to GRD. That'll spool up at about 20% N2. You can go ahead and turn your fuel cutoff levers to idle. That'll let fuel go into the engine, and it'll spool up the rest of the way. And then basically we're letting this snap back to off. Should also put our ignition on right, probably. So we'll just let that go ahead. And start to plan out our taxi a little bit. So we're going to 13, which means we're going to be going via probably Delta Bravo to the end of the runway. We do have some fuel in the center tanks too, which we can turn on our fuel pumps for. That's 60% in one, that's about right. This is snapped back. Put that into continuous and start the left engine. Should see that come to life down here. That's good enough to add fuel. So to idle, should keep spooling up, and we'll be about ready to go. I am going to turn my parking brakes on just in case my throttles are set up so that we don't drift forward or backward or anywhere. So once we have engines on, we can turn off our APU. We need to go over to generators, turn off the APU, and then turn on our taxi lights and get ready to taxi. So that's 60% and 2. Just a flick down to the generators. You can also use your mouse wheel for that if you have the standard MSFS mouse options. They do come with another mouse, a PMDG mouse option. I'm not sure what all goes into that. So APU off, taxi light can come on, and we'll just pop up here and do one quick scan. So yaw damper on, fuel pumps are all on. We're on the right power. Window heat is on. Probe heat can come on after engine start. Shouldn't need any anti-ice. Hydraulic pumps are on. We'll go to passenger cabin. Recirc fan on auto. Engines on. Packs can come on. Isolation valve can come to auto. And APU bleed can come off. We're at 29,000, so let's set up our cabin pressure altitude here. 29,000. And then our landing altitude today into Houston is going to be about 42 feet. So we'll round up just a good smidge to 50. Okay. So we are set up, and I think we are ready to roll. We'll make a traffic call and get on the way. Love traffic, Southwest 1, taxiing runway 13 left via Delta Bravo. Love traffic. Now, as we taxi out, we can set flaps 5 for takeoff and review our takeoff performance here. Probably should start that before you start rolling, but hey. And Delta should just be this one right here. So clicking through to our takeoff page in the FMC. Again, if you want to know more about programming the FMC, there are good tutorials out there. Many from many different versions of the 737 over the years. But essentially, this is our takeoff ref page. This is going to give us all of the takeoff information. It's calling for a trim of 7.08 today. We're going to do a full bore takeoff. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to do any derating, although there are calculators you can do to basically use a lower amount of thrust for your takeoffs. So we're going to adjust the trim until it's about 7. That's 5. That's about 6, and that's probably about 7. Now on our way down, we'll put auto throttle armed, and we'll worry about the rest of the automation as we get there. All right, so we're going to taxi on out, and we will get fired up at the runway. We are now approaching the runway here at Dallas Love. Takeoff is going to be fairly straightforward. We're going to essentially put our lights on, make sure probe heat is on. Then we're going to advance the throttles to about 40% N1. Once we're there and stabilized, what we want to do is hit the toga button, which can be mapped, but I have weird behavior when I hit the button mapped to my joystick, so we're going to hit the screw here There's also a button down here on the throttle for the toga button. And all your lights configuration might be different depending on what airplane you have. That's another thing that changes between them. Some of them don't have the retractable landing lights. So just very small user facing kind of changes depending on what airplane you're in, and that all kind of maps to the livery you're flying with. So we're going to go ahead and taxi out, take the runway. Again, advance throttles to about 40%, and let them stabilize, and then hit toga. And from there, the airplane should do the rest of it. I'm also going to arm VNAV and LNAV. Now, if your LNAV doesn't arm, it could be just a little finicky. It could also just not like it. That's how I understand how the real LNAV kind of works. If you're doing it during the taxi, you might just be not in the right spot for the computer to recognize you can arm it. All right. So we're here, brakes on. We'll advance the throttles to about the 4. Let it stabilize. And let it go. Now we're listening for callouts, so basically we're going to add a little bit of forward pressure until we hit 80 knots. Back on the stick. And then at rotate, we're going to pull back on the stick. And that's about 132 knots. It's just going to depend on how, heavy you are, how many people you have on board, how much fuel you have. Gear can come up. And then as we pass that 1 notch, we can bring the flaps up. And start arming our autopilot. So LNAV armed, we'll arm VNAV as well, and then hit the Command A button here to engage the autopilot, and it should follow the magenta line and the flight director cross here. So now we can bring flaps fully up, and now the 737 is flying itself out. You can see we're really taking off like a rocket here. It is gusty, 16 to 20 knots gust. One thing we did miss, auto brake should be an RTO, so we did never reject the takeoff, but if we did, we would have been not in great position with the auto brake. So auto brake to RTO, and then now we're up and flying, and now it's off. Our top altitude on the chart is 8,000 feet, but we will go ahead and we'll clear ourselves up to flight level 290. And so this airplane has a VNAV, vertical navigation, which means it's going to follow the VNAV target set out in the chart and set out in the FMS. So it's going to hold 250 knots until we get to 10,000 feet and then go up above that to our targeted cruise altitude. We need to be below 6,000 feet at Dorset and above 6,000 feet at Hayes. So the airplane has those constraints and it's going to try and meet those. So there you go, a couple of seconds, and we got the airplane flying itself. Now this is, again, something we talked a little bit about with the CRJ, but the 737, it's not a particularly, at least in a sterile, not multiplayer environment, it's not super there's not a lot of stick and rudder flying with these airliners. But you're using the automation pretty much the whole time. The important part is understanding how the automation works and what the procedures are for, flying in the actual airspace. If all you're trying to do is go from A to B, you're hitting the autopilot and just flying in a straight line, it's probably not that rewarding of an experience. But I think a lot of the rewards of airliner flying in particular, it's a very detail-oriented mode of flying. And the keys to enjoying airliner flying, I think, is online, human ATC. It adds a little bit of realism, but really it also adds someone watching out for you to say, hey, you didn't do that quite right, or which is a little weird to say, but it's not really even supposed to be mean-spirited. It's just forcing you to actually pay attention to things that you wouldn't normally pay attention to if you were just flying on your own, that didn't inconvenience other people. and then knowing how all this works. So if ATC tells me to do something different than I have programmed into my FMS, I need to be ready to know what buttons to hit to make the airplane do what I need it to do. And the 737, this is all pretty intuitive. The buttons, when they're lit up, that's the mode you're in. This is your heading selector. You rotate it around, the purple line. Like, it's all very, very straightforward. You have all the kind of different modes you would want to do. You can do a vertical speed climb. You can do a speed climb. You can do a level change. You can tell it to hold a specific speed, even in VNAV mode, so you can hit this button, and then we can, dictate what speed it needs to go at. So again, that's all kind of a sub-learning effort here, is learning, using the automation and learning how it works, and what you need to do throughout all phases of flight to comply with whatever air traffic restrictions you need. All right, we're above 10,000 feet, so seatbelt signs can come off, our landing lights can come up and retracted. Don't need any extra drag. Runway turn-off lights and taxi lights also can come off. Everything else is pretty good. And from here, we're really monitoring systems. That's really it. We're going to climb up to 29,000 feet, and we're going to monitor the systems. Now, if we go down to our progress page, it'll tell us exactly when that's going to happen. Topic climb, 1903 Zulu. It is 1856 Zulu now. One other feature of the PMDG, if you're doing longer flights, this button here, this kind of top button, TC/SR, that's what controls the sim rate. So PMDG has a custom sim rate control where it'll auto cruise for you. It'll speed up time during the cruise and slow it down as the sim kind of requires it as you're doing maneuvers. Or you can kind of turn that off down here in your options and just run 2 times, 4 times, 8 times like you could on any other airplane. So you do have some options if you want to do some longer hauls cruising. I have used it a little bit. It does help out if you're trying to get a flight in and you don't have a whole day to do, I don't know, say Denver to New Orleans or something like that, right? So that's a handy thing to have built in here. One other shout out I should say is for this livery. The default PMDG cockpit is pretty clean. It looks pretty factory fresh. This one added some weathering. There's some weathering options you can add on flightsim.to, but this is a part of a mega pack of Southwest liveries by Javiation on flightsim.to. I'll link the pack in the description below, but essentially he has a couple Canyon liveries as well as a pack of 12 modern Southwest Heart liveries. So we are cruising out over Texas today. Not a long flight, again, about 45 minutes or so, point to point. But 737 is cool for a couple reasons. First of all, there are, and this is not just the 737, but a bunch of airliners that are what I would call high fidelity available for Microsoft Flight Simulator now. Now, prior to that, you really had the Aerosoft CRJ, which is a good detailed airplane, good to fly, lots of stuff for it. But it doesn't have a lot of the advanced features that the 737 does in real life. Like, you don't have a VNAV built in, which is your vertical. So everything in the CRJ you're doing manually as the pilot. So it's a lot more involved. No auto throttle in the CRJ2. This airplane is pretty much completely automated in that respect. And same for something like the Phoenix A320, which is also out, pretty comparable to this. That's exciting, again, because there are a lot of really cool, really detailed airliners in the sim world for other sims. These are kind of the first mainline airliners for Microsoft Flight Simulator. And it's very detailed. It's a very faithful representation of a 737, which is a cool experience. It has a lot of depth to it if you really want to dig into the nuts and bolts of how to fly a 737. Or if you just want to, have a relatively complex airliner to fly with and mess around with. You've got that here. And it is a really cool thing. It goes really well with the scenery. The other awesome thing about this one and the PMDG model is its performance is fantastic. I say that as it stutters, but that's really more of a sim thing that's been going on for me for a while. But the performance, the FPS, I've got really smooth performance, and my rig is not this highest end in the world. Get really good performance on this one, especially for a complex airliner with all these screens. It's fantastic, and I was really impressed with that. That's kind of the sneaky thing I was impressed with. But the model is good. The texturing is good overall. There are places where it could use a little bit more resolution, but there's always that trade-off between performance and resolution there too. So nothing that would ever hurt your enjoyment of the sim. And again, we're getting the Dash 700 is out. We've got the 800, 900, and the 600 still to come from PMDG. We're going to capture the altitude now. But that's why it's cool. And again, the 737 to me personally is cool because, again, it's kind of that universal, if you ask a kid what an airliner looks like, they're pointing at something like a 737 usually. And, you know, that's as an American, there's something that appeals to the 737 to me. I fly on a lot of 737s in real life. It seems like a lot of the time you're on some kind of variant of a 737 in the States. That varies where you're, depending on where you are in the world. But so I have more of a connection to this airplane than something like an A320, which is a little rarer for me. Not too much, but a little bit in my experience. And that changes year over year. You may well be different. There are other options too. Again, the Phoenix A320, not an airplane that I have. I prefer the 737. But that's another very comparable option. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But very cool, ubiquitous airplane. Lots of variants. The cargo variant, the BBJ, the cargo variant's fun for doing cargo flights. It's nice to have a dedicated cargo airplane in the sim. The BBJ is fun for doing long-haul stuff, I find. So doing a transcontinental flight or a transatlantic flight, or flying basically anywhere in the world, doing a long haul. You can do that in a BBJ. You can load it up with 9 auxiliary fuel tanks and just have 70,000 pounds of fuel and go forever and ever and ever, if that's what you want to do. It's not quite a replacement for some of the long-haul big jets, but it does scratch a little bit of that itch. And so you have options with this package about how you fly it and where you fly it. But again, the 737-700 is a good common Southwest airplane. Southwest Airlines has the most of them. Alaska Airlines, Delta has a few still, and United still have a few too. Mostly being phased out. But they're good for kind of somewhat more trafficked regional routes to longer mainline routes. So you kind of get a little bit of happy medium too. Some of the similar things we talked about with the CRJ, the sub 2-hour flights, a lot of those can be done in a 737-700 if you're looking for a specific reason for this variant in particular. But again, 700, 800, 900, the different 737 variants are very similar from a cockpit perspective. There are small in places where the panel is different up here, but again, broadly speaking, it's the same. The other fun thing I like is the ground handling stuff, unloading and loading the airplane. I wish it had animations associated with it, but it is fun. It gives you kind of an inbuilt way to manage that. Your passengers take some time to deboard, so if you're planning that out, if you're trying to hit a specific time to leave your gate, you need to take time to load all the baggage, to fuel up. It takes time to fuel the airplane. It takes time to load passengers. But if you don't want to mess with any of that, you can also just go into your actions and change the payload directly. So there's room for all and different ways you want to fly with it. All right, so that's top of descent. We're coming on downhill now. You can see we're descending about 950 feet per minute, holding a speed of 250. That's not quite right. We want to be at 280 at max, I think. It's going to say I'm unable. We'll give it a try. That vertical speed, again, you can see we're just descending much faster. Which is just fine. And again, it's these small things that you have to do to kind of meet all these different restrictions and understand what they mean and when they mean it and how to get the airplane to do what you want it to do. That's kind of the challenge of this. It's not so much the stick and rudder flying. So what do you need to know to fly the 737? A checklist is good, or some kind of learning aid. 737 NG Driver is a YouTuber, has a ton of detailed tutorials about what the real life procedures look like for that particular airline. I think it's Ryanair, but I don't know. Others, there are plenty of 737 pilots out there, plenty of tutorials, especially if you look for P3D, PMDG 737 tutorials too. A lot of that is going to be very, very similar to this. Because same airplane, same developer, same basic model of the airplane. So find something like that, but I have a checklist that I use And that's what I, go down the line with. So get comfortable with some method and some flow before doing it. If you do it enough, you probably won't need the checklist after a while. And it's not actually that complicated to do. I mean, the CRJ might be more complicated. I don't know. It's not that complicated once you get it, understand where everything is and all the things that need to happen. It really isn't. So the other thing that you need to know really is understanding the automation, especially if you're going to fly on VATSIM, you're going to fly something like that. You need to know basically the basics of how to read a chart and how to use your automation. So the automation first, what your VNav, LNav is doing based on the FMS, and how you take control over all these modes. So if I want to fly on this particular heading, I need to hit heading select. When I go to do my approach, I'll hit the approach. You just need to understand all of that and those different permutations. Again, it's very straightforward, especially if you've flown the CRJ like I have. You'll plug into it pretty quickly. It's not rocket science. I find the A320 to be more confusing with the push and pull stuff, but 737, pretty straightforward. The other thing, to I think get the most out of this, you should fly in a... I've got to go down further. Just cycle VNav here. I think an online kind of ATC service, whether it's VATSIM, whether it's something else, iVow, even Pilot Edge, that adds a lot to the experience of flying airliners too. Not that you need it. There's other options like Pilot 2 ATC, but some kind of ATC plugin usually helps enforce that learning. But to do that, you need to learn how to read aviation charts and need to have source for charts. Again, in the US, ChartFox is a really great resource. If you have VATSIM account, you have a ChartFox account, and but it's all kind of, you can dig it all up on places like FlightAware too, pretty straightforwardly. SimBrief I use for flight planning, and METAR/TAF I use for most of the weather, usually flying on live weather with this airplane. So that's the big thing, is to get the most out of it. I think you need to do something like that. Again, not that you have to, but that helps me personally dig into a lot of the systems that I otherwise wouldn't worry about. I'd wave my hand at. Now, as far as your other options for an airplane like this, you're actually in luck. There are some that have come out recently. The big one, as far as payware airplanes, is the Phoenix A320. It's slightly cheaper than this one. I think 60 euros, which is, I don't know what that comes out to in dollars, but slightly cheaper than the 737 from PMDG. And again, comparable level of fidelity as far as an A320 simulation. So if you're an Airbus guy, if you like Airbuses, the Phoenix A320 might be the airplane for you. But again, basically everything I say about learning and getting the most out of the 737 applies to the A320. You also have the BAE 146, which is more of a regional jet airline, but that's another detailed older school airline. Or they fly the Mad Dog MD-82. Again, another kind of older school airline, similar to a Boeing, but again, kind of its own thing. Not quite a regional jet, not quite a bigger mainline jet, but it fills a similar niche to the 737-700. As far as defaults or freeware stuff, the fly-by-wire A320 obviously is probably the pinnacle of that. So if you have Microsoft Flight Simulator, you have the A320, you can go and install the fly-by-wire A320, and you've got a relatively high-fidelity airplane that you can practice with. We're going down to 16,000 feet here. So you have some options. Again, if I want to fly an A320, I'll fly the fly-by-wire A320. I'm not an A320 expert to know some of the big differences between that and the Phoenix, but if you're an A320 guy, you look at the Boeing and get a headache, check out the Phoenix A320. Other airplanes coming soon. Again, the PMDG is going to fill out the rest of the 737 line over the summer with the 600, then the 800, then the 900. And I think then they go to a 777, but not sure about that. So now we'll bring that down to 250 knots. We'll continue our approach, or our arrival into Houston Hobby, KHOU, and I'll pick you back up as we're getting ready to shoot the ILS for runway 4. Alright, so we're coming up on GEO now, here. 6,000 feet we'll aim to be at, and then we'll go down to 4,000 feet and turn to capture the localizer. Now, one thing we do have to do is put in our localizer frequency, so you got to put in the course and the localizer. So this is going to be a course of 041, and we'll put that on both the the captain and first officer one. And the localizer frequency is 109.9. So that's nice and easy. You got to set it on both of those so you can use, otherwise you'll get a single channel error. You got to punch in both. We'll get there. So again, we're going to go down to 210 knots here at the decel point. We may need to use a little bit of speed brake. Now, the other things we need to get ready are our auto brakes. We're going to go auto brake 2 for today. We'll arm the speed brake just as soon as we're ready. And then just looking at our limits. So we can extend the landing gear anywhere below 270 knots, but generally, when we try to capture the glide slope, we can go out and have the ILS localizer and glide slope. We can extend the landing gear, but it is also helpful if you need to slow down below 270 knots. It's, you know, it's one tool in your toolbox. You also have flaps. We can go anything below flaps, anything up to flaps 5 below 250 knots. Again, if you need more drag coming down. This airplane I find a little bit harder to manage than the CRJ, descending with a lot of energy. So if you're coming down, if you were up too high, too long, and ATC gave you a clearance to descend too late, those are some of the tools in your toolbox. Again, 250 knots for flaps 5, and then flaps 10 to 10. We're going to use flaps 30 for landing. You can go flaps 40 if you're at a really short runway. You can also, I believe, do it at flaps 15. But flaps 30, 165, our final approach speed will be 140 knots today. 141 at flaps 30. So we're going to descend. Basically, once we hit that, we're going to descend. At this point, we'd probably be talking to ATC, so we can go ahead and say descend 4,000 and turn left heading, whatever that is, 100. And 210 knots is the key. We can use a little speed brake there if we need to, too. Speed brake gets less effective as you get slower, but around anything above 250 knots, it is useful. So bringing it down to 210 knots. At that point, we will shoot to join the localizer for runway 4. Now, when we have at or above 2,000 feet, we can go ahead and punch that into here. That way we just have it on our... we have it set. I'm going to arm approach mode 2. And we're basically going to descend down to 4,000, and the airplane's going to basically try to capture the localizer like we do in the DC-6, but it'll automatically do it. .210 knots, I also need to go down and hit the actual altitude level change button. You can see the glide slope. We want to capture the glide slope from below, ideally. We're a little behind that now. So we'll even clear ourselves down to 3,000 feet. In an attempt to catch up at 210 knots. So we have drag out, and again, we are a little higher than I would like to be, so we're going to add a little bit of flaps. So we can go flaps setting 2 now. If you're looking for your flaps, what flap setting you're at, it's this dial right here. And we should start to see the glide slope come up a little bit. So we've hit app mode with these two involved. Once we've got the localizer, I'll hit the auto, engage the first officer's autopilot. And I'll also just help the airplane come around a little bit to capture the localizer. That's helpful, again, if you're doing parallel approaches to avoid an overshoot. So we have the localizer now. You can see VOR loc here. We have the localizer. We'll activate the second one. And now we've got the glide slope 2. So at this point, I'm going to put it in altitude hold and let it capture the glide slope naturally. So it'll hold, we'll hold 4,000 and let it capture the glide slope. Another thing we do is start coming back to 180 knots. Now, I try to practice staying at 180 or more until 5 mile final, because that's a typical instruction you'll get in the States, is maintain. If it's busy out, they'll want you to be at least 180 knots until a 5 mile final. So that's what I try to train for. Again, a slower earlier is usually better for me. Coming down from 180 to 140 in the 737 can be a little bit much to ask. But we have the glide slope. We are within speed limits, so gear can come down. We're now at flaps 5. Below 195 knots, we can go flaps 15. Alright, that's going to be another 2 ticks of my flaps button. I'm actually going to even swap that over to approach mode and let the airplane fly us. And now, beautiful day today. This would really be a visual approach, but you can see the runway just in front of us. And here you can see we have the localizer, the course, and then the DME from that localizer. Okay, so we have gear down, auto brake is on 2, seatbelt signs are on. We can turn our landing lights on, would be a good thing to have. Light everything up. And yeah, we should be ready to come in. Now, landing the 737, it's no great secret. You don't want to flare too early, but again, we're going to aim for the aiming point. What I've heard is that at around 50 feet above the ground, you cut the power, and at 30, you start a gentle flare. It shouldn't be any really more than 2 degrees nose up, and that'll get you down. Again, that's in theory. We will see. Weather in hobby is 4 knots at 230, so not much wind at all. So we're at 2,000 feet, 180 knots. About a 7-mile final from the localizer there. About 5 miles on my waypoint, so I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to 141 now. The other thing, we still got speed brakes out. We'll bring them in and arm them. Basically, once we're a little bit slower. Not that it's doing all that much right now. So, click down to arm it, and then we can go as far as flaps 25. Once we're below 165 flaps 30, which will be our final flap setting. That'll also help us drag up the airplane and get the speed down. Now, I have autopilot disconnect bound on my joystick. I'd recommend that, but you have to hit it twice to shut off the warning. So if you get a warning, if you hit it once, you're not doing anything wrong, just hit it again and it'll go off. It's stuff like that the Boeing I kind of like, but it's not necessarily the most intuitive thing in the world. 150 knots, we will go ahead and bring flaps to flaps 30. And generally, I'm trying to learn. I personally am trying to get a better sense of how to hand fly the airplane. So I like to take it a little bit early. I like to take auto throttle off too, because you know, I just am never quite sure how it's going to respond to me sometimes. And it doesn't take huge inputs to do what you need to do. Throttle should be around 50%, I've heard. But again, just gentle inputs and just try to follow the flight directors and keep that glide slope where it should be. We're a little slow, but it's not too bad. Getting a little low, but again, not too bad. Add a little power. And then again, we're aiming for the big white boxes. And it depends on how the airplane is configured, how many callouts you're going to get. Depends on airline to airline.
100. Sync rate.
Oops,
50.
come down a little fast.
30.
It's just a gentle flare. Plant it. And we're down. Then I also have reversers bound. I have this bound to the reverse thrust axis in Flight Sim. Or, sorry, to the decreased thrust bind, I should say. So I have it bound to a button that I press on my joystick, same as I do in the CRJ. So if you have something that works in the CRJ, it'll work in this for the reverse thrust. And then just a little bit of brakes at the end to get us down and off the runway. All right, welcome to Houston, everybody. That is Southwest 1 coming into Houston. We will taxi off the runway, get clear, and taxi onto the gates. Clean up the airplane. Landing lights off. Taxi lights on. This is a good start. Time to start the APU-2. And we'll just go that down to steady. And you can, clean up the panel as you want. Now, you can save states. That's another thing we haven't talked about, but there is a way to save panel states. So if I just wanted to stop right now and save where I'm at, where everything is configured, where all the buttons and all the dials and all the everything, you can save a state using the FMS down here in PMDG setup. All right, so we are here in Houston. We made it. A really fun, short 45-minute flight. If you're looking for something to do in your airliner, that's a good one. Southwest 1, KDAL to Houston Hobby Airport. Houston Hobby is a big Southwest airport. It's not the biggest international airport. That would be Bush Intercontinental, KIAH. But Houston Hobby is all Southwest. And anyway, that's the PMDG 737. And again, airliners more broadly too, I think. It's a very detail-oriented thing. If you have a certain, it scratches an itch for me. And it may not be your thing, but who knows? Maybe it is. And there's a lot of depth to the simulation. You can kind of go as deep as you want to after a certain basic level of competence, but it does really force you, especially if you're flying online, to learn how airspaces work, to learn how, your actual passenger plane. If you're flying somewhere, how does that work? How do the pilots communicate with everybody else? That's a really cool thing. It's a really cool system as a whole. And, the airplane, the detailed airplane like this, really gives you that high-level experience in that. So it's lots of fun. It's a really nice model. Again, the PMDG 737, we talked about the other alternatives. The Phoenix A320 is also a really great call if you're more of an Airbus fan. But there's room for all here. And, yeah, definitely a cool plane. Definitely an exciting time in the sim. And there's a lot of cool stuff, I think, involved in this. But great, especially for Americans like me flying American routes. So that's it for VFR today. If you have any questions, comments, ideas for future stuff, anything you really love about the 737 or the Phoenix A320 or your Mad Dog or your BAE 146 or any airliner, drop in the comment section below. And yeah, this has been a lot of fun. It's a fun flight, and there's just a lot of fun things you can do with these airplanes. So that's it for VFR today. Take it easy, everybody.